Bryan. It's great to see you. I'm looking forward to our conversation today about what is a bank. So we at Payments track the digital behaviors of consumers all over the world on 37 different activities, including banking services, those activities done digitally. Surprisingly, banking through digital channels is 50% higher than activities like shopping online, texting, and even working, and it's second only to activities like streaming video and music. With that as a backdrop, what do you think the lasting impacts have been of this great digital shift in moving banking from physical to online to digital and the expectations now that consumers have about those activities?
Yeah, I think number one is convenience, right? And I think that's why you see such, a much higher use of digital for banking than you do for, retail and other commerce. Because you don't need to try things on, you don't, it's easy to return, all those types of things that make digital retail a little bit harder. So, the fact that you can do things 24/7, simple, transfer money, open accounts, do whatever it is, I think has, definitely fundamentally transformed banking when we couldn't go into the banks anymore. So I think, there is that. I think also one of the reasons is it's become much more personalized. They know what I'm doing. And just like retailers suggest things to do or make my life easier, I think banks have begun to do the same thing. They realize, we're basically a retail customer as though, going in and buying a shirt, which also, digital banking has also made it easier to shop for where you want to bank. So I think that's one of the reasons that we've seen, every bank that we're dealing with is focusing on what is the customer experience in that whole, digital transformation. And I think also with that, came an expectation from consumers of security and privacy, right? Because they read about the hacks that happen all the time and PII getting, hacked and then used for identity theft. That has become a big expectation. I think, a lot of your research shows that, in terms of which banks are trusted, which aren't, and what people care about. And I think the final thing, because I believe that, there's a definite age difference in who uses digital versus who doesn't. I think it's brought a level of financial literacy to sort of the younger generation. My kids do everything in their banking online, and they've got cool apps they show me that I've now taken up because it does help me understand a little bit better about what I'm doing, where I'm invested, and maybe where I should be. So I think those are the things that, people have come to expect that really didn't exist before COVID.
I think that's true. And I also think that the user interfaces have gotten so much better. So I think part of the engagement is because it is easier to do things like check your transactions and, to your point, move money, send money, and just check on your activity. It's better. And even 87-year-old people can do it. 17-year-old people can do it. So it really is one of those things that I think digital has bridged the generation gaps in some of those activities. But it does question, what's the role of a branch? When was the last time, Bryan, you went into a bank branch?
I was thinking about that in preparation for this, and I think it's when I changed bank branches and had to get a new lockbox. So it has been quite a while since I've gone in, because it used to be you had to go in for everything. I think that still people want to go into branches, so, there are obviously, I think, some transactions that I would want to go into the bank for, opening, closing, anything that's major, I would probably go into the bank. And, it is definitely changing in terms of also, I think, how people want to deal with it. I think banks are learning a lot from retail and how to be omni-channel and make that a smooth transition from wherever I am, so I don't have to repeat myself. Because I think that's one of the biggest peeves to the consumer. We've all had that experience of you call up a call center and you get transferred and you have to tell your story all over again. People don't want to do that. And I think, the branch experience to really succeed needs to make sure that it can tie into anything that I might have started at home.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, what's interesting is the expectation is that you can just walk into a branch and have anything you want done. And that's not always the case, because typically if you go into the branch, it's because you have something to do that is different than the usual day-to-day transactional activity. So it's
Mhm.
almost as if there needs to be this clienteling relationship where you educate consumers to make appointments so that the right person can
Exactly.
be available when you're there. But that takes a little bit of a culture change on both the consumer side and also the branch personnel side.
I think there's a couple of things that are helping to expedite that. Certainly I think the banks have realized that. So they, I think, are putting a lot into training and education of the people that work in the bank branches so that they can do more and also are able to handle that, again, omni-channel. How do I take it from outside to inside? But also I think what we're seeing, because I'm on my bank mobile app and I'm doing research, on things before I actually do it. And I think, the internet has made it so I don't think anybody does anything without, you go and search on it first. And I think that educating the consumers to do that and why it benefits them. Because again, think about it. The last thing you want to do is go in, stand in a teller line, get up to teller, and then they say, oh, well, you need to go stand over in that line now. But if I could make an appointment and know that I'm going to be seen right near around that appointment, I mean, a couple of things come out of that. I mean, the customer experience is fantastic, which breeds loyalty. It's if I know that going in and waiting forever, I'm going to look for some other place to do my business, no matter what that business is. And again, before this big digital revolution in banking, we were just used to you had to go in, stand there and wait, to get to one of the open tellers. I think that everybody moving to much more digital commerce has changed that model forever.
Yep, I agree with that. I also think that consumers like being able to serve themselves, whether it's, through an app or through a call center experience. I mean, we pointed out some of the aggravating, pieces of that where you're constantly, having to repeat yourself. I'm a famous aficionado of 0 pound. I mean, I'm just a 0 pound kind of girl to get to an agent because I don't want to have to go through all of that.
I'm with
But
you.
but I do think that technology is helping those online those chat experiences to be better and richer. And I do think that, the more you can put tools in the hands of consumers to serve themselves, leaving the branch for those things that are more complicated, I think every channel does its work for the benefit of the consumer and the bank.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. If you think about, so much of what people would go to banks for was deposit checks or all those things. I mean, technology has made it now. You take a photo of your check and it's in there. So again, make it easy for me to do, at my kitchen table. 90% of what I want to do in banking, it's good for me, it's good for the bank, it makes my life simpler, cuts their costs, and then leave that banking experience for something that might be, again, more complicated, requires some education, requires maybe a little bit more human interaction to ask the questions to make sure that I'm getting the right banking product that I need. And I think you're starting to see, we certainly know that we're seeing, our integrations with banks going beyond the teller workstation themselves, but into things like tablets where, they can walk around and you're having a conversation, you're sitting somewhere comfortably, and they're doing everything that they need to do, through that tablet, which is really an extension or a connection to what I have in my mobile app. So, the technology is again, revolutionized how we go shopping and certainly how we go banking.
Yep. We're talking about bank singular, but people have many accounts
Yep.
with many banks. So you see a lot of the unbundling of banking services, whether it's related to lending, transacting, investing. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on how you see the aggregation of all of those banking activities happening. I mean, because right now, it's up to the consumer to sort of figure out all of that and manage it individually. Digital wallets are becoming more of the aggregating layer for a lot of the transactional activity and, buying and spending and so forth. Where do bank apps fit? Where do you think digital wallet apps fit? And where do you see the intersection of both of them, if you do, when it comes to keeping track of all these various activities and accounts?
Yeah, I love my digital wallet, because it makes my life simple. And I think it really makes it simple in everything that I'm doing, for payments across, anything in the online landscape. And, we certainly see retailers are beginning to put in digital wallets so you can do payment. One that we work with not only allows you to use, their loyalty card, but you can load up to, I think, 9 other cards depending on who you want to pay for that transaction. And I think, and that's good because, I'm going to much more likely to use that app when I have control over how I want to, pay for it with a touch of a button than having to pull everything out and start typing in numbers, even with the way the computer can say, which one of these do you want to use? It's still much quicker to just tap and go. I think banks are going to have to do the same thing. Certainly some of them, my banking app has a digital wallet where I can put in, my credit cards and things. They're going to have to think about how do they interact, because standalone is always harder, for the consumer, because who wants to download a million apps? Because, I've got a ton on my phone, and then when I'm sitting on a flight and I got nothing to do, I'm like, haven't used that forever, and I'm deleting. But getting the consumer to actually interact with the app once they've downloaded it is very difficult. So I think that, collaboration, different payment models, you look at Zelle, a consortium of banks, when they get together, they'll come up with some pretty good ideas that could make things better for the consumer. So I think it's going to be evolving.
Yeah, I think it will evolve. And I think this aggregator, sort of the open idea of having one repository for all of these things to manage, is what consumers will find attractive. The everyday app concept we've been talking about for a while, and consumers like it because it simplifies the complexity of all of those activities. I want to go back to something you said earlier, though, about trust and security and fraud, because that's obviously at the core of what the banking relationship is to that consumer or business. Trust that my credentials are secure, my data is secure. How do you deliver that today in an environment that's very distributed, very digital, and ripe for opportunities to have fraud and security lapses?
Yeah, I think that is probably one of the number one things that consumers care about. Study after study shows that if your data has been hacked, about 30% of the people will leave, right? So you've lost the long-term value of that client. I think your research has shown that, 83% of people are comfortable with the security features that banks have put in. But, the converse of that is almost 1 in 5 are saying that they're not. And, if that 83%, if their data, gets hacked, it's, they think about moving. I was actually just with someone the other day who was looking in real time as their debit card was being used in multiple places in the country because they were seeing it in real time on their app. They really began to question, it's like, wow, what should I do? This is a debit card that they sent to me that I haven't received yet. Should I trust my bank? So yeah, and it was interesting to see New York, California, Kansas City. We were seeing transactions happening in each one of those cities, again, popping up in almost real time. So people definitely care about what is the security and what we're doing. And I think, from what we've seen and who, and the banks that we work with, particularly on this, security and validation and stopping identity theft, it was just like retail. I think they jumped into it so fast because they had to with COVID. And just like many of the retailers, they were relying on the old knowledge-based authentication, which that's the stuff that anybody can get through because you can buy all that information from us. So I think the fraud rates were spiking up. I think that what we're seeing is that more and more banks are looking to authenticate based on types of transactions. So that, if it is something that looks like the precursor to account takeover, they're going to contact you in some form or another to see if you're really doing that, or have you provide through the app or online some authentication solution to prove that it's really you. Because again, super, super important, because the sums that we're talking about, they're non-trivial. And at the end of the day, the bank eats it. So it's a big loss to them. But, they lose the revenue, but then they also lose sort of that trust. And you stop trusting in your financial institution, you begin to look for somewhere else.
So we talked about the examples of retail, the omni-channel experience, doing a great digital experience. You talk about fraud and security and also the lessons learned from moving online. I mean, what are the broad takeaways from this conversation with respect to creating a good digital experience for the consumer so that banking is more efficient, using whatever channels are appropriate for the consumer based on the transaction that they're trying to accomplish, while eliminating unnecessary friction, but preserving the trust and security of the transaction and the banking relationship overall?
I think it sort of plays off what I just said. I think first step is education. Make sure people understand why we're doing these things and how we're putting them through it, and which then becomes the whole user experience. Um, you know, the research we've done and talking to customers and prospects and things, the number one thing they care about is, again, that user experience, because they want to get as many customers as they can. And if you fill it full of friction to do 100% protect yourself, you're going to lose a lot of clients that because they just don't want to deal with it. I mean, I bailed out of plenty of applications on things. It's to the point where I'm like, why am I doing this? If you work in, if you think about it holistically, you've got a process, you want to bring people on, you want to make sure they're who they say they are, you want to run through AML, KYC, and then get them. If you think about that as a continuum and build your whole process that way, we just recently worked with a bank that was creating a whole new digital, an app to, open up an account online. And they really did think it through very, very well. Their goal was a 2% increase in completed applications. After they, rethought it, incorporated, validation techniques that also speed things up for their customers, they saw a 20% increase in completed applications. So I think it's really, think about the customer, not the criminal, and then build your process around the customer that, almost as a byproduct of doing right by the customer, you then stop the criminals. And, I think thinking about it that way creates a much better outcome for both the consumer and the bank.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Focus on the good behavior and you'll be able to address the bad behavior or keep the bad behavior at bay.
Yeah, and there's plenty of stats, where fraud exists and what happens, and you can make, it slightly more difficult for one area or others. We see in social media, fraud attempts to take over accounts, 16%. At your average, department store, fraud rates are closer to 0.6%. So, but they add up to a lot of money, but
Sure.
you got to do the trade-off. Is it worth, stopping every little bit of that 0.6, but at what expense? If I now have made it so that, 1% of good people went away, it's probably not a win.
Yeah, it's not a win. Exactly. Interesting conversation, Bryan. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.